we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Buckley Biggs with AgriWebb. For folks who haven't been by our booth, which is just over here with the neon sign, AgriWebb is a livestock management software company. We're very involved in helping ranchers to collect the data, the records they need to be part of sustainability programs, and that can look like a lot of different things. So today we're here to talk a little bit more about what sustainability programs mean for ranchers, what's happening in the corporate space. We have Belinda from McDonald's here to shed a bit of light on that. And then also what role NGOs or nonprofits are playing in this space. So Jacob Gilley here with American Farmland Trust. Really thrilled to have both of them here with us today. And we'll do a bit of discussion, but also towards the end, I'd love to take your questions. If people have questions about what this means that we haven't yet answered, we'll try to squeeze those in as well. So to properly introduce my guests, Belinda Richardson, she is the U.S. Sustainable Sourcing Manager for McDonald's, and Jacob Gilley is a Senior Technical Livestock and Grazing Specialist with the American Farmland Trust. And our topic today is corporate sustainability programs. So what does that mean? To put it simply, corporations today are feeling increasing pressure to tackle their sustainthe profile, to reduce their emissions, to improve biodiversity in their supply chains, to really improve their environmental footprint. And one of the elements of that they're feeling pressure on is reducing the carbon emissions, so the methane, nitrous oxide, the greenhouse gases that are coming off of ranches and off of farms as well. So reducing those emissions as well as building soil carbon. That's a way of drawing down the emissions from the atmosphere and sequestering them in the soil. Altogether, that can help a ranch produce more sustainable, lower carbon beef. Now, as corporations are trying to look at their carbon footprint and understand where they're at today, how can they make improvements, they know that they need to engage ranchers in this activity because, after all, cows spend most of their time on the ranch. So without ranchers involved in this discussion, there won't be any progress around these sustainability outcomes. So what I'd like to get into is, well, what does this mean for ranchers? If ranchers need to change practices or share records or be a part of a sustainability program, what does that look like? How might it benefit you? What is in it for you? So to kick us off, Belinda, when you think about sustainability and beef, can you talk a little bit about what are those pressures that McDonald's is feeling around sustainability, and how do you think about sustainability?
Absolutely. And to start off, McDonald's is very humbled to be up here talking to all of you. Obviously, we're one corporation, maybe not the smallest, but still just one company doing this work in sustainability. So it's really great to be up here to be able to have this discussion with everyone here at NCBA. So I'll start off, I think what a lot of people think about when you think of the pressures on corporations around sustainability, a lot of times the first thing that comes to mind, or maybe what you think of, are some of those external pressures that our companies might be facing. So, you think about McDonald's, a global company, a lot of stakeholders. We've got investors, we've got our franchisees who are in their own right, they're small businesses. We've got our consumers who more and more across the different segments of our consumers, and even in the US, we're seeing sustainability come up as an important topic. And then you've got potentially local, federal governments, some of the regulatory and compliance issues that potentially in the future we would need to pay attention to trends and things that are coming down the pike. But I think often what folks maybe don't realize is there's also a strong inherent motivation to do this work in sustainability, because we really want to improve the resiliency of our supply chains. On-ranch resiliency of stocker backgrounder operations, the feedlots, and all through our supply chain is really going to assure supply of beef into the future. And we want to continue to sell hamburgers, U.S. beef, in our restaurants into the future for a long, long time. So I think that inherent motivation is something that folks don't often think about that really motivates us. And I think there's a lot of alignment. So what we've heard and what we've come to understand is really the same practices that ranchers implement to improve your operations are the same practices, the very same practices that are going to help us achieve our goals in sustainability. both to meet our public goals when we talk about sort of mitigating our footprint, reducing our footprint, some of these climate smart programs that we're setting up, but also to be able to improve resiliency on the ranch and throughout our supply chains. And we just bake that into sort of a resilient business strategy moving forward. And I'll tell you a story. I won't name names. I don't know if he's here, but someone from Texas A&M has told me a couple times, ranchers who adopt these practices, sometimes they're regen grazing practices, sometimes they're climate smart practices, sometimes it's a suite of practices when we're talking about a program or practice implementation. And these ranchers, once they get 4 or 5 years in, they rarely, if ever, revert back to what they were doing before the practice change. And so that's a really strong implication for us that we are, in fact, aligned with what producers need to do to improve their operations. And that is, in fact, the same thing that we want to incentivize to help us meet our corporate goals.
I'm going to stay with you for a minute here, Belinda, before turning to Jacob. As you're thinking about these goals and what practices producers might adopt, how do you engage with your supply chain, and specifically with ranchers? How do you engage with a rancher around sustainability? What does that look like?
And our supply chain is huge, right? So raise your hand if you're in our supply chain. I feel like every hand should be raised. Raise your hand if you're in McDonald's beef supply chain in the U.S., right? Probably everyone in this room is in our supply chain. So we partner with our direct suppliers, certainly, but our work in sustainability really allows us to go farther upstream in our supply chain than we ever have for any of our other work streams, and really try to engage from the ranch all the way through our supply chain for this work. So in addition to our suppliers, and our suppliers, and their suppliers, we also need to engage. We've found third parties to do this work. And those could be trusted intermediaries that work with our ranching partners and the producers all through the supply chain. Those could be technical assistance providers. So if farmers and ranchers know what they want to implement but don't necessarily know how, we can bring in third parties, companies, academia, NGOs who are knowledgeable on how to do that, can get ranchers and producers connected with some of the resources that they might need, whether it's financing or know-how. And then there's these organizations, to be able to claim these impacts as a company, as a beef industry, we really need to be able to quantify the impact that we're having through this practice implementation. And so we also have third parties who can help us measure the impact, collect that data, and make sure that we're making credible claims as a beef industry. So it really is all of those partners across the supply chain and in the industry that are really making this change happen.
Great. So let's layer onto that. We're lucky here that Jacob, yes, he works at American Farmland Trust, but he's also a rancher, and he's got his rancher hat on. So I want to ask you first, can you share a little bit about your family operation with everyone?
Sure. So Jacob Gilley with American Farmland Trust for my full-time job, and my other full-time job, my wife and I run JG Livestock based out of Virginia. We've traditionally been buying more high-risk type cattle from local sale barn, backgrounding them, using the best standards, practice standards possible, and then sending those loads out to move through the supply chain.
Awesome. Okay. So maybe just to start looking at these practices, these climate smart practices, when you think about sustainability, is this about ranchers doing what they've been doing and having the data to prove that what they're doing is sustainable? Or is it about producers changing practices and doing something totally new from what they've done before? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I would say for most producers, we've been doing a really good job. And a lot of these conferences we come to, everybody says, tell your story, use social media. And that's great, but we need to have actual hard statistics, data, soils data, production data to back that up. And so on our operation, we've been utilizing AgriWebb for the past couple of years. And I think the important thing for producers to take a look at is, yes, this data could be important and leveraged to obtain extra revenue for the operation with regard to achieving climate goals, but also that data is the same data that's going to help you be more profitable on your operation. actually taking the time to analyze it and say, well, how can we do things better? How can we be more efficient? Because an efficient operation is certainly one that's climate smart.
Great. I just want to pause for a moment. If anybody wants a seat but doesn't have one, there's tons of seats here. There's 3 in the front, so please come on in, and you won't be interrupting if you grab a seat if you want to sit down. So as producers are starting to hear about climate smart commodities projects, USDA grants, sustainability programs, what can they do to prepare? And I'm happy for either of you or both of you to answer this question. What can producers do to prepare? How can they understand better what their options even are?
So I can start with that. So working with an NGO, we see ourselves as a trusted source working with farmers and ranchers. And I think building relationships with folks that you trust at kind of a grassroots level within your region, within your state, and getting all the facts about all the opportunities. There's a lot of information coming at us producers right now about the Climate Smart Commodities projects and other projects around climate. And I think just really looking at your options and before signing that dotted line, really just kind of reading everything closely. And when we look at the potential revenue from carbon credits, for instance, that opportunity is still pretty young, in my opinion. And I think being able to collect that data, have the data, and AgriWebb at their booth, they've got a checklist that has the different types of information that they can currently collect through AgriWebb, and then other information that you'll want to collect on top of that would have an impact for your operation that eventually somebody's going to want. And if they want it, then there's revenue opportunity there.
I'll just add to that when we say data, we really mean ranch records. And when you go down a level deeper, what does that look like? That's stocking rates, it's fertilizer use, it's tillage. So those are things that can impact the carbon cycle at the field level. It impacts the carbon intensity of that piece of meat that you produce at the end of the day, of that animal. So we might be calling it data, but you probably think of it as just your ranch records.
Yeah, and I think with land becoming more scarce and it's, sprawl, urban sprawl, being more efficient on every acre that we have available is going to be vital for operations to be profitable and sustainable moving forward.
You mentioned the Climate Smart grants. I'm wondering, Jacob, if you could share a little bit more about the one that we're on. So AgriWebb is part of a USDA Climate Smart Commodities grant that's led by the American Farmland Trust. So as the project lead, could you share just at a high level, what does that look like? What's the timing on it? Is it happening?
It is happening, finally.
Excitingly.
Yeah, USDA has been quite slow. But it's a 5-year project, $30 million. And for the Climate Smart Beef project that we're partnered on, we're working on that in the Mid-Atlantic, so Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, also in the Southeast, would be Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and we've partnered with Integrity Beef Alliance in Oklahoma and Texas. 30,000-foot view. The project works closely with producers through peer-to-peer learning, mentor networks, extensive training opportunities, technical and financial assistance, putting money in the hands of producers to adopt out-of-the-box practices that are climate smart, and then also extensive soils data collection. So partner Earth Optics is collecting a lot of data, or a lot of soils data, and we're linking that up with our production data to complete life cycle analysis. And that's just a fancy way of saying we want to know what our impact is. And I think the beef industry, especially at the cow-calf level, we have a really great story to tell and what our cattle can do for the lands that they're grazing. And so that, and then the marketing piece. So looking at how do we leverage this information that we're collecting to be able to market live cattle as climate smart. And that's whether you're selling 5 beef off your farm direct to a consumer, being able to tout that, or if you're sending out loads of cattle to progress through the supply chain, being able to capture some premiums from that. But then also looking at the potential revenue from carbon credits. But that's not a requirement of the project for producers to sell carbon credits. And so it's very much a science project to collect data to validate what we know about our industry.
Great. Jacob said carbon credits, so I might just break this down quickly for anyone who's curious.
You do that quickly?
Yeah, I can. I'll try. Give me 30 seconds. Carbon credits come in 2 forms. There's carbon offsets, which we always hear a lot about. Then there's carbon insets. Those are 2 different things. I just want to be very clear what we're talking about here. Carbon offsets, you might increase your soil carbon, you have that measured, and then you sell the credit to a different industry. You might sell it into Microsoft or oil and gas. Somebody else outside of the agriculture industry buys that credit, and they take it off of that carbon amount off of their accounting books. So basically, it looks like they didn't emit that amount of carbon. When you do that as a rancher, you can't also claim that your beef is that much more sustainable because you sold the right to claim that, okay? But you got income from it. An inset, it's more than 30 seconds, I know, but bear with me. A carbon credit that's an inset is very similar to an offset, except for the buyer is someone in your own supply chain. So it's McDonald's coming and buying that credit from you. It's not leaving the supply chain, so it's actually staying with that cow. It's staying with the beef, and it means that the beef is more sustainable because you're attaching the carbon claim to that commodity that you're selling. Does that make sense? Roughly? Okay. So when we're talking about corporate sustainability programs, we're really talking more about carbon insetting, that type of carbon credits. We're not really talking about carbon offsetting, although that's another, a discussion we can have another day. So, Belinda, I want to go back to you and ask you here, is there something you want ranchers to know about McDonald's sustainability projects and how it can really benefit them? What do you want to leave them with today of when they're thinking about considering maybe participating in McDonald's project with AgriWebb? How could it help their family and their operation?
Yes, it's a great question, and I'm going to go back to what I touched on around alignment. So we understand that the same practices that are going to help your operation are also going to help us reach our climate goals. But it's not prescriptive. So we are not the ones to go in and say what should be done and where and how. Really what we want to do are work through those trusted partners, work through those experts, and help ranchers achieve those impacts that we can then quantify and as an industry claim. So really, I guess the bottom line, all of that to say, because we are aligned in what we're trying to implement and the impacts that we're trying to achieve, it really is, ranch resiliency and your business resiliency is our business resiliency. So it really is that shared business success. And key to that is producer economic viability. So if you're not profiting and if you're not a viable and resilient business, then neither are we. And I think just the other thing to mention, sometimes we say partners, the partner ecosystem, the partner landscape, partnerships that put these climate smart grants and programs together. And like I said, that really is through our supply chain, trusted intermediaries like your cattlemen's associations, third parties and companies who can come in with services and new tools and technologies to really help enable all of this practice implementation and adoption, practice change, quantification of impacts, help us to understand, the difference between insets and offsets and what's the best option. But producers, you really are the key piece of that puzzle because you're implementing the change and generating impact on your ranch. And so really just knowing that, when we think about partnership, it's everyone in our supply chain, and especially producers to continue as a viable business. So
I'm going to open it up for questions in a moment, so maybe start thinking if you have any questions for these guys. And while you do that, last question for Jacob. We've mentioned climate smart practices, but what does that look like as a rancher? What does that mean you have to do tomorrow? What are some examples just off the top of your head of what's included in these programs?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll lead with is its context. It very much depends upon your geography, your rainfall, your environment, your context. So where I'm at in Virginia, and we are starting to get hotter summers, drier summers, a lot of variability. So we've been planting native warm season grasses, deeper rooted. They grow better, higher forage quality during the summer, and so being able to utilize that quality. Genetics, I think, focusing on buying cattle that will perform, that I don't have to hold as long, because when we look at methane, production, the faster that calf can go from birth to finish and still produce a high quality product, that's the goal. So looking at genetics there as well. And then for us, reducing the amount of harvested forages that we utilize, let that cow harvest the feed as much as we can. And then reducing the amount of fuel that we use on farm. So that's just a handful of things.
Great examples. Thank you. Okay. Any questions in the audience? Or comments as well? We can run out a microphone, I think, if needed. Questions? Go ahead. Oh, we've got a mic coming.
McDonald's and several other groups have made pretty sweeping commitments for net zero by 2050. Is there actually the toolkit available to make that happen, or is that a pipe dream?
So this is my favorite analogy, working in sustainability. We're building the plane as we fly it, right? So I think we're creating the tools and sort of trying to accelerate the pace at which we can set these things up and achieve those goals. So we do have our ambitious sort of long-term 2050 net zero goal, as do other companies. And we also have intermediate goals that we're really working hard to materialize those and sort of meet those commitments on our way to 2050. So yes, it's ambitious. No one's 100% sure we're going to get there, but ultimately, as a North Star, that's sort of what guides our work. And we do have sort of 2030 climate goals that do look very achievable, given sort of the tools, technologies, partnerships that we're setting up, the opportunity that we know exists within agriculture as part of the solution. But absolutely, just sort of zooming out from ag, we also have what we call our scope 1 and 2, so our restaurants and our offices, processors have their facilities, so it's really working across all of the business, not just the supply chain, to try and reach those goals. But it's a great question. Yeah.
Other questions over here?
Test, yep, that works. We're beginning to see blooming of third-party certifiers. I think Patagonia launched Regenified. There's the Savory Institute, which has been around for years. Who do you see emerging as the leader in that? Because when you, as a consumer going into the grocery store, I'm looking for USDA organic certified. That's pretty well established, imperfect as it is. But who do you see emerging is going to be the standard in that? When you go in and you say, it's regenerative agriculture, okay, I'll buy it.
I want to turn this to Belinda, but just a quick comment first. In a lot of cases, corporate sustainability doesn't result in a label on a product in the grocery store. So, for instance, a methane reduction program that McDonald's is doing might not necessarily mean that they call the burger a low methane burger, right? So there are a body of verifiers and certifiers whose job it is to look at, well, did that rancher have the right data in order to even do a carbon footprint? That's kind of their certifying role. There's a different group of certifiers that are like Regenified, for instance, or even like Audubon, bird-friendly certified, where they are looking to put a label on the product that a consumer would look at when they're choosing which steak to buy and say, this one looks better for me because of its sustainability profile. So I would just kind of frame it that way in terms of two different groups. Belinda, do you want to jump in on thoughts there?
Yeah, and not much to add. I mean, there is one avenue that is direct to consumer, where consumers are going to see those labels. They'll know which ranch it came from, which producer produced it, and sort of what the criteria are for those will be, more or less understood. For McDonald's and other, I think, restaurant brands and companies, we don't have that traceability through our supply chain. And so we really are trying to quantify, as Nick was saying, just quantify the impact we're making, whether it's on the ranch, at the feedlot, and really understand that for ourselves so that we can credibly make those claims towards our public goals and sort of know that we've had that impact. But there might not be a label that consumers are seeing that they would have to sort of identify and decode in that case.
Good question.
I'm not sure who this question is to, because you kind of talked about this a little bit. But does every producer have carbon credits on every farmer or rancher have them on their farm that they can account for? And should they be looking at kind of the profitability, like you were saying about insetting or offsetting? Like, is this something that every producer has? Because I'm sure there's lots of producers out there that aren't really haven't started looking at that as a profit center for them. Is that fair? Is that the right question? I'm not sure if I'm
It's
saying
a good
it quite
question.
right.
I'm going to ask Jacob actually to answer it, and I can fill in if needed.
I thought you'd handle it. I would say that's complicated because looking at the delta, the change, and that's where we have a lot of conversation. We want to prevent producers that have been doing the right thing. We want to keep them able to partake in the party, for lack of better words. Producers that maybe have been overgrazing and maybe tilling, there's greater opportunity there to improve. And so therefore, the way the current system is set up, they're more attractive for the carbon market because there's a greater delta there. And I think that's one of the major pitfalls of how this is set up. And so we're still having a lot of conversations of how do we not alienate the producers that have been doing a great job for the past 20, 30 years in their practices. I don't know if I answered that correctly or what, but...
I would agree with it. I would hazard a guess that very few producers have already done everything possible to reduce the carbon intensity on their property. So I would just, this is kind of pulling a number out of the air, but I think more than 99% of ranchers probably have an opportunity to participate in a carbon credit market of some sort. Whether it's soil carbon, whether it's methane, whether it's nitrous oxide, there's probably something they haven't tried yet. Maybe they could do a genetics intervention. Maybe they could try pasture seeding. Maybe they are on degraded rangeland and they can try to improve the soil carbon. So I think very few people are actually totally left out of this market because they've just knocked it out of the park. I mean, that's kudos to that operation who's already done everything possible to improve. I mean, I think all of us with a profession are on a professional journey, right? And the same thing with ranchers. There's always something like the next step that you can take.